morning, everybody. I see folks are joining us, and we're going to give people a minute to join. So while we are welcoming folks onto the platform to Zoom this evening, my name is Cecile Lipworth, and I just wanted to give a few welcome points. First of all, you are here for a series that we are hosting. Black Women's Blueprint and the National Organization for Women are partnering and hosting, called 100 Days of a Feminist Agenda, Healing from Centuries of Oppression. Our work is not yet done. We're thrilled to have you all join us this evening for the second in our series, which is the topic is the unspoken impact of police brutality against BIWOC, TGNC, and Latinx communities. I will let our moderators introduce our guest panelists, but we wanted to let you know that if you could first put in the chat boxes where you're from and where you're tuning in from, we'd love to see where everyone's joining us. And then later on in the evening, we are going to be doing a Q&A. Please put your questions into the Q&A box rather than in the chat, so we can really be sure to try and get to as many as possible. I want to thank our ASL translator, Santana Chavez from RCG Access. We're really glad to have them on board this evening, and we will be having ASL translation throughout the series. As you saw on the slides, we have another 6 conversations, so please do either go to the Now website or to Black Women's Blueprint so you can register for the other upcoming series. The next one is February 25th, and it's all about women's reproductive health. And we'll have some registration links, and we'll put some information all into the chat for you during the course of this evening's conversation. It's my pleasure now to introduce our moderators, Savannah Brown, from a co-executive director of Black Women's Blueprint, and Triana Arnold-James, who is the president of Now Georgia. Savannah and Triana, will let you continue with the conversation and introduce the panelists. Thank you all for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Cecile, to the entire team at National Organization for Women, for the community who is gathering, bearing witness, and joining us. My name is Savannah Brown. I am the co-executive director at Black Women's Blueprint. And we are really gathered here as Black Women's Blueprint and the National Organization for Women, hand in hand, and in collective partnership and lockstep, really to unite our communities in all their diversity and in convergence across the country. And we're so excited to have the incredible panelists, speakers, siblings, movement comrade with us tonight, joining us virtually, right, to unapologetically center the narratives of Black, trans, cis, GNC voices to speak about the impact of police brutality on women and femmes in our communities, and to uplift and center our voices really as requisite to racial justice. The police murders and the increase of prisons, while threatening to eliminate resources really to our community and our base and our community power, undermines the richness of our community, right? The vastness of our community and our ability to do the work of protecting ourselves, building futures, and all at the expense of our bodies, all at the expense of our lives. And so tonight we say that is too old a strategy, right? We say in these first 100 days, the feminist agenda that we propose, where we will not allow it, right? Where we say, not again, never again will we bear the brunt and the multitude of racialized, sexualized abuses, not at the hands of the state, not in our communities, not ever, right? And so we hope this conversation will bring us closer and closer to mutual resistance and liberation and freedom dreaming and making of the demands that this moment calls us up and requires us to be in. I'm really excited to hand it over to Triana Arnold-James, who will be the co-moderator and co-facilitator for this conversation, and will also introduce our panelists tonight.
Good evening, afternoon, depending on where you are. um, um, so happy to have you all here. And again, my name is Triana Arnold-James, and I currently serve as the president of Georgia now, and I'm also on the national board. So thank you all for joining, and our special guests, who I'll introduce in a few minutes, for the discussion on the topic that I care deeply about, police brutality. As you know, here in Georgia, advocates on the ground just made history by us electing our first Black and first Jewish U.S. senators ever. So I'm really excited about that. These two victories in Georgia were very significant. We defeated two far-right anti-choice federal legislators who had been undermining and chipping away at our progress in our fight for equality. We've seen that what progress can be, when we elect diverse leaders. Just looking at our mayor, Keisha Lance Bottom, and who's a personal friend of mine, and Representative Congresswoman Lucy Macbeth. And we've been able to do that. So we're excited to see how Senator Ossoff and Senator Warnock will continue with our progress. These wins were hard fought. I know that personally. and are a result of long-term organizing by a beautiful, vibrant coalition of Black and Brown, Indigenous, transgender, non-binary community, religious minorities, just countless of residents in the state of Georgia and outside the state of Georgia. We got a lot of help, which I really appreciate that, who've been fighting against the insidious of white supremacists that has plagued the South for centuries. And guess what? Black women led the charge. So I'm so excited about that. And despite these wins, we still have a lot of work to do to disentangle from the vestige of ideology that infected institutions and led to disproportionate treatment of certain communities, especially in our own criminal justice system, especially among Black and Brown sisters and brothers. This evening, we are looking forward to discussing how we can create a new frame and make space for future where all communities are liberated from persistent police violence, dominance, and domination, and discrimination, whether it's on the streets or in our homes. I believe at that point, we are supposed to introduce the guests. So I guess we can start introducing the guests at that point. Monica, are you on the line?
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be introducing our guest tonight. And we are going to start off with Commonwealth, Virginia Commonwealth Attorney Stephanie Morales. Stephanie was on February 10th, 2015. Stephanie was the first woman to be elected Commonwealth Attorney in Portsmouth. She is a mother of four, a wife, an author, and a fighter who has committed her office to seeking restorative justice daily and correcting the wrongs to members of the community by the system. In 2015, Stephanie Morales established the Control-Alt-Delete program to foster successful reentry for the formerly incarcerated community. Additionally, she has mentored over 200 students under her program called the Future Leaders Initiative. She also established in 2015 and spent time with countless youth through a consistent engagement with the public school system. Commonwealth Attorney Morales advocates daily for those who can't fight for themselves and to end and disrupt racism and inequity in the legal system. She fights for legislative reform centered around providing restorative justice to our community members. Beyond being Commonwealth's attorney, Stephanie Morales is an author. She just wrote a great book, by the way, with a new children's book. Oh, here it is, called The Day I Became a Lawyer. She is also a member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority, the Links Incorporated, a regional director for the Young Elected Officials Network, a board member of the Legal Aid Society of Southeastern Virginia, and is a national board member of the Local Progress Organization. We also have M. Adams joining us today, who is the co-executive director for Freedom Inc. M. Adams is a community organizer and a co-executive director of Freedom Inc., born and raised in Milwaukee. Adams has been in Madison since 2003. Adams' dad has been incarcerated most of her life, and she comes from a community that has been the extreme targets of police violence. And in March 2016, Adams' mother transitioned after fighting cancer and many forms of violence. Adams is also a dad and sees her family as a primary motivator for her work. As a queer Black person, Adams has developed and advocated for a strong intersectional approach in numerous important venues. M. Adams is a leading figure in the movement for Black lives and Take Back the Land movement. She is presented before the United Nations for the Convention on Eliminating Racial Discrimination and is a co-author of Forward from Ferguson and a paper on Black community control over police. She has authored The Intersectional Theory and Why Killing Unarmed Black Folks is a Queer Issue, and Adams can be regularly seen in person, on TV, or in the newspapers giving presentations, testifying at city council members, and energizing crowds at protests. Thank you for joining us. And lastly, we will have Dr. Neil A. Lester. Dr. Lester is Foundation Professor of English and founding director of the multiple award-winning Project Humanities Initiative at Arizona State University, an initiative that brings together individuals and communities to talk, listen, and connect. Dr. Lester has authored or edited 7 books and has just completed an edited volume on global social justice across professions and disciplines. His research centers on African-American literature and culture, including Black masculinities, privilege and bias, cultural appropriation, American popular culture, and the N-word, and children's literature. He's a popular keynote speaker, discussion facilitator, media interviewee, blogger, and op-ed writer. Thank you so much to our speakers for joining us, and I will hand it back to our co-facilitators, Triana and Savannah.
Thank you, Monique, so much. I really appreciate that. I'm kind of a little off, y'all, just a little break here. I had stayed up all night. I have a grandbaby, a new grandbaby. She was born 7 o'clock this morning. And so I've been up all night waiting on this little diva. Okay, so let's get into this discussion. Let's see. I have a question for Attorney Morales. I hope I pronounced that right. You were an advocate for restorative justice program early on in your career and have been pushing for progressive criminal justice reform. Even before it became a topic of national discourse, can you talk a little bit about restorative justice and what that means for the community? What does restorative justice mean in terms of violence against women, and what does that look like?
So first of all, let me say congratulations to you. I can't not say that on your new little one, your new little grandbaby. We have to acknowledge, and as a prosecutor, I'm the first one to say this because often my profession does not want to. We have to acknowledge that the criminal legal system has been harming communities, for as long as it has been in existence, and it is operating as it is designed to operate. It is harming people. My profession has harmed people, and restorative justice is about making a voluntary effort to repair the harm that has been done consistently, especially to Black and brown people, Black and brown women, for as long as any of us have known about what this system has done. And so for our communities, that restorative justice really has to be tailored to what has happened in the individual community. We, as a system, we are centered around supposedly justice and fairness, but we cannot allow justice and fairness to look like a one-size-fits-all solution. It really is so much more complex. The damage has been so deep, it has destroyed generations of families. We have passed down this legacy of incarceration, which has done nothing but harm us and put us in a position where we are unable to thrive, unable to build intergenerational wealth for our families. And we are dealing with society in a way that is not, conducive to our survival, let alone our ability to thrive. And so for my community, restorative justice meant, one, we got to hold police accountable. One of the first things that I did after being elected, unfortunately, was we had a police killing, and I prosecuted that police officer for killing an 18-year-old unarmed African-American young man, William Chapman II, and secured a conviction. So police accountability, system actor accountability is a part of restorative justice. People want to talk about reconciliation, but we can't do that until we begin to repair the damage that has been done. So accountability, holding myself accountable, holding law enforcement accountable, the programs that you heard about where I am dealing with people who have been previously incarcerated and trying to give them an opportunity to talk to someone and have a voice about how they can be successful. That's a part of repairing the harm that has been done with over-incarceration. Speaking up that we need to decarcerate, and that we should not be incarcerating for nonviolent offenses and for instances where people are not a threat to our community, and engaging with and fostering the development of our young people, our future leaders, providing them with opportunities, fighting for things like ending food insecurity, providing them with appropriate and adequate housing and education, opportunities to thrive, opportunities to engage in industry, really taking a full circle approach to seeing our people succeed in a way that we have never done it before, investing in our communities in a way like never before, and stopping, this concept that people are violent in any way that is different from the way our country has been violent. We are in a violent country. We're in a violent nation. We have had great harm that has been done to us, and nothing has been done over the past 400 years to move away from that and to change the legacy of this country. So all of those things are the way I approach restorative justice, voluntarily working to repair the damage that has been done and stop it from going forward. When we talk about violence against women, domestic violence, we have to talk about the fact that if there is going to be a restorative justice model, we hear about restorative justice circles, opportunities for victims to confront the people who violated them. We have to talk about this being done in a voluntary manner. And so it is different from that system approach, that community approach that I talk about as a system actor, when you are talking about people who have been violated in some way, and then bringing them around the people who have done the harm. We have to talk about, the voluntariness of this, giving women the ability to choose whether they want to be involved in that process, one. So I cannot have a conversation about restorative justice without first saying this has to be something that the person who has been violated wants to engage in. But that whole process, is about, again, repairing the harm that was done, not just talking to the victim and giving them that sense of peace and closure if they want it, but also the person who violated that victim, getting them to understand the harm that was done and how they can go about ensuring that they never give that type of harm and give that type of damage to anyone ever again in the future. So I don't want to, I could go on forever because this is something I just celebrated my 6-year anniversary yesterday of being elected. This is something I've been fighting for the past 6 years, is to see us, in this cycle of harm that has been done. But I represent 2% of elected prosecutors as a Black woman. And so I'm hoping to see more prosecutors who will acknowledge the harm that has been done and fight hand in hand with women, fight hand in hand with our trans community, fight hand in hand with all of the people who are being harmed so frequently, and uplift and give voice to those who don't have voice. Take our platform and say, here, you come and talk, because, I have the power, but I want to use my power, my platform, to give you the voice, because you are the ones who can speak to the harm that you have endured. So thank you so much for bringing me into this conversation. And I very much look forward to hearing what everyone else has to say as well.
Well, I know we have a program here, but I speaking of that, and speaking as a prosecutor, one of the things that we're dealing with here in Georgia. And I don't know if you've read up on the Rayshon Brooks case. Well, it's like the Fulton County DA and the Attorney General is playing, tennis, volleyball. They keep passing it back and forth to each other. And the community is saying that, the officer that shot Rayshon Brooks should be held accountable. And but so how does restorative justice look like when it's our own community that's doing it, that's doing it to each other? Because the Fulton DA is a Black woman, first Black woman to be elected as a Fulton County DA, and doesn't want to prosecute this officer and pass it on to the Attorney General. And then the Attorney General will say, well, I don't want to prosecute it either. And so it's like a back and forth and nothing is being done. So how does restorative justice look when we're doing it to ourselves? And you could just touch on it real quick, or we could talk about it later or whatever. I know we have a program going on here.
Yeah, I will just say, this is about accountability. The restorative justice component was something I felt we needed that reconciliation in my city to say, like, hey, I'm here, I'm standing up. And when I did that case, when I say I did it, I don't mean somebody in my office did it. I mean, I prosecuted that case myself, did all of the pretrial motions over the course of the year, did the jury trial myself. So I say that to say, you guys just had that election at a time when our country was awakening to some of the things that I have been seeing and many of us have been seeing for years. We shouldn't be having this conversation about anybody running away from this responsibility. That is about accountability. That is about being accountable. Before you're accountable to your community because they elected you, you got to be accountable to yourself, because there are all types of things that we're responsible for that people on the outside looking in don't get to see. And so I did those cases in the way that I did and have indicted another officer, for a different offense, because I was being accountable to myself to be the type of leader that I was elected to be. So, before you can even get to doing restorative justice, you first have to be accountable. And so I would say to the members of that community, I know it's frustrating if that is what's transpiring because this person was just elected, but you have to continue to hold this individual accountable and say, hey, we didn't elect the Attorney General to do this job. We elected you to do this job. And unless there is a conflict of interest, a clearly stated conflict of interest, there should be no special prosecutor. My bar and many of the attorneys who I know and respect have a bar that unless we have a conflict of interest, we will not be seeking a special prosecutor, because this is what our community members elected us to do, not somebody else who's not accountable to them. So this is an accountability issue. And my hope is that there are activists on the outside and other system actors on the inside who can reach this person who's newly elected. I will reach out as well and say, hey, I support you, sis. I congratulate you and I support you. And I will help you in any way that I can as you hold yourself accountable to hold this individual accountable for the harm that they did. Now, if they're saying that there's, a reason why they're not going forward, then hopefully transparency will encourage them to explain to the public why. Again, if there's a conflict of interest, be transparent, explain to the public why. But in absence of a conflict of interest, stand up and do the thing. There are many of us who will stand lockstep with her and support her as she goes through what is no doubt going to be a difficult, but a critical and necessary process.
Right. Thank you so much. And I will turn it over to Savona.
Yeah, thank you so much, Triana and Attorney Morales, for taking us and setting the stage for us to be in rigorous conversation, because I think that's what we need right now, right? And I really want to bring M into this conversation, and just thinking about your work, right? What your work is centered on, especially explicitly looking at survivors of sexual and domestic violence, right? Providing support, whether it be legal aid or crisis intervention or home community, right? To women, femmes, youth, through your advocacy and all of your work to safety plan and build community safety, and to really nuance this conversation and ask the question about what does it mean, right? There's been a broader conversation about this for around the past decade, but more than that. But what does it really mean to defund the police? How that fits into an abolitionist conversation as we're building on dreams of restorative justice processes that work, whether it's between community and the state or between community and community. What does it really mean to defund the police? And what are we saying when we say that? And how would this impact communities that are most affected or impacted by police violence? So wanting to hear from you, from the front line, from your work, from your movement strategy and your movement hat, what that articulation means and what that demand looks like.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here, and shout out to the panelists who went before me, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the remarks of the panelists. This is such an important question. What exactly do we mean when we say defund, and who is the who demanding defund? So I'll start with saying a little bit about myself. So as mentioned, I'm from Milwaukee, born and raised. I come from a community that's hyper-policed, from the zip code 53206, which is unfortunately described as the worst zip code in America. And I am a survivor. I've survived many different types of violence. And I'm saying this to ground this next statement. And I'm also an abolitionist. Too often, abolition is seen as something that survivors would not want, or something that survivors would not demand. And so abolition in its plainest sense is not supporting and not using police, prisons, or jails to solve our social issues. We think there should be a radically different approach. So I am someone who thinks that to end sexual assault, to end domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and many other forms of violence and abuse from community to community, or from state to community, as you mentioned, that using police, prisons, and jails will not suffice. And in fact, it'll make it worse. So as a survivor, and more than that, as a feminist, I've come to that analysis by my own personal life and lived experience as being a survivor who did not use the police, because I did not think the police would actually help me in my situation. And also as someone who works every day in community with supporting survivors who, some of them do choose to use the police, but the policing systems actually exacerbate the issue that they're experiencing. It actually makes it worse for them. And in fact, one of the long-going work that we do inside of my organization is helping to get survivors free from incarceration, because many Black women are criminalized for surviving sexual violence, domestic violence inside of their communities. And so because of that, because of having this vision of defund, which says we should not be using prisons, jails, or police to solve our issues, we should do something else, we have demanded the end of funding to policing as we know it, policing as we understand it. And so defund means just what it sounds like. It means no longer investing in policing and policing institutions, and instead using that resource and using that wealth, human personnel, capital, building infrastructure, all the things that current law, legislation, all the thing that goes into policing to support policing, instead to use all of that resource and all of that talent into building communities. And so an example of what this would look like. So one of the folks that we worked with a long time ago was a woman, a young woman at the time, named Ciara Finkley. And at the time, she was probably, God, I want to say 22 or 23 years old, and she was a mother of a 4 and 5-year-old, and she was in an abusive relationship. And her partner was really, really abusive, and she had reached out for help. She didn't get the support she needed inside of her family or his family. She even called the police department several times that day, saying, help, 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 can you come? He's trying to kill me. And basically they're like, nothing we can do. You're on your own, kind of leave us alone. And on one particular day, he tried to harm her and her child several times. He tried to run them over with the car. She got into her apartment, locked the door, and he was able to get through the downstairs apartment door and up to her apartment door and inside of it. And on fighting for her life and her child's life and defending herself, he died as a result of that incident. And believe it or not, the police showed up right away to arrest her and to charge her for murder. So abolition has this analysis that what happened there was absolutely wrong from start to end. At the very beginning, we need the resources in our communities where Black women like Ciara do not have to stay in abusive relationships because they have options to leave if they so choose to leave, right? So we know how Black women stay in relationships because of economic reason, housing, not the cultural family support, right? We need to be changing those things. And then also when survivors ask for help, we need people who can show up that'll actually help, right? That will center her survivorship, that will center her child's survivorship and take that as precedent or priority. And then also we don't need this armed force showing up after she's been through an incredibly traumatic event, her and her daughter, to come in and to separate her from her child and threaten her with a lifetime of incarceration. And so that is a common experience of Black women survivors, of Black queer trans intersex survivors. And as an abolitionist, we say instead of investing in a tank, tanks, bombs, militia gear, bulletproof vests, bullet hollow point tips, and all these other things that did not help Sierra, we instead should be investing into Sierra's wellness, wholeness, and leadership. And that does not look like a cage. That does not look like brick and mortar that incarcerates her, separates her from her child. And the last thing that I'll say about this is, as a feminist and as a survivor, defund is critical because we know that policing is a form of patriarchal violence. If we are going to build a world that is good for survivors, we have to be serious about ending patriarchy altogether and all of its manifestations. And that includes existing as a hyper-militarized anti-Black institution. And we know that anti-Blackness and sexual violence are inseparable. And so to that end, we say defund, no longer invest our talent, our resources, our capital into systems that harm and destroy Black people and Black lives, and instead shift those resources to institutions, community groups, formations, places that build up Black life and support Black survivorship.
I mean, you've just given us so much, right? Like richness. And one, I want to extend gratitude to you for honoring us with your lived experience, right? And grounding us in your survivorship and how that politicizes you and how that positions the way that you think about the way we liberate ourselves, our communities, and our families. And then also Sierra's story, right, creates this complex, like kaleidoscope, like window into how we think about what safety looks like, what sovereignty looks like, what it looks like to raise our children, to be at the intersection of safety and a reproductive justice frame, right? I think that you've given us so much like packed into those examples, and they illustrate the everyday. I'm thinking about my aunties right now. I'm thinking about my family members. I'm thinking about my siblings who've needed to call the police. I'm thinking about disputes and how their wellness and you named wholeness and their care is not enwrapped in community, but instead the state is responsive at all times, right? To all of these formations that our community takes. And I couldn't help but think about the ways that you kept situating, right, this individual story also in this intergenerational frame, right? The context of them being a mother, right? The context of them being a survivor and seeking support and seeking what could cradle them in that moment, right? And so I have to also ask this question, as recently as last month, a 9-year-old girl was pepper sprayed by police in Rochester, New York, right? 6-year-olds handcuffed in classrooms for how their hair is done or how they respond to an assignment or the way that they embody themselves, right? What have you seen in your work with Freedom Inc. and also across formations? What have you seen the impact has been also on Black girls and queer youth in particular, policing, whether it be in schools, in their neighborhoods, in their community centers, even in COVID, right? What do you think this intergenerational impact is? And thus, what do you think the impact of defund will be on future generations? And just if we can just hear that from you before we bring Dr. Lester into the conversation.
Absolutely, this has an intergenerational impact. And because the issues of policing are intergenerational, they are historic, it is deeply connected to legacies of enslavement of Black and African people on this land and also around the world. And we know that that is hundreds of years old, and we know the consequence exists for us, for our children and our bodies and our DNAs, that trauma we are still trying to unpackage or to remove from ourselves. And so it absolutely has an impact. So policing does not just affect adults, it absolutely affects children. One of my only memories of my father as a child is seeing him removed and sentenced to prison for a very, very long time. And the fact that that is still a vivid memory for me, I know lives in my body and lives in my DNA. And so we cannot leave out what happens to Black children, the impact of the carceral system on Black children, on Black life. And I think that that just speaks to the visceral and terrible anti-Blackness embedded in that system, because Black children are not even seen as children when we think about the total consequence of that system, right? Nobody steps up to defend, not nobody, but the system, the mainstream does not step up to defend Black children because our children are not even seen as children. And to speak specifically about what happens to women and girls and also young people, and why I'm saying it's so important to understand policing as a form of patriarchal violence is this. So I am a parent, I'm a father, I'm a queer father of 2 children, 2 adopted children who I'm so proud of and who I love. And as I mentioned, my children are adopted. So I'm very intentional about family forming, family bonding, and also teaching them things about healthy relationships, dignity, respect. And I teach my children things like your body is your body, right? This is your body. Nobody has the right to touch you in particular places. Nobody has the right to force your body to do anything. You have the right to feel safe. You have the right to not be harmed. You have the right for nobody to be putting their hands on you and doing all of these things. That is antithetical to policing. Policing does all of the things that I tell my children is never okay. And you know what breaks my heart is the video and the story rather of Sandra Bland, because I think Sandra Bland was acting and behaving in the way that I teach my children to act and protect their bodies. That is why that is so dangerous. That is why policing is so dangerous. I fear for my Black daughter. You hear people talk about their sons, which I think is important. I support and love Black boys and men. But I fear for my daughter's life. Do you understand me? And this is why I cry every time I see that clip about Sandra Bland. I fear for my Black daughter's life, who is young, Black, and 20-something, who is full of fire, spunky, and feisty, who has been raised by me, who says, you better not let nobody put their hands on you. You are my child. You walk with your head up, chin up, and with dignity. You do not let people mistreat you, disrespectfully harm you. All the things that policing does. So I fear for my child to know that to raise a Black child well means that they are a threat of police violence, right? It means that they can be harmed by policing. And so the impact is deep. For us to be raising Black women and girls, queer, trans, and intersex folks with dignity and with the sense of autonomy, of bodily autonomy and choice. Now, hear what I'm saying. We're feminists, right? To be instituting ideas of autonomy, choice, your body, just sort of cornerstone, fundamental feminist, right, issues puts you at risk of police violence. That is the impact, one of the impacts, and one of the consequences of policing on Black women and girls. It is a direct affront to our bodily integrity, autonomy, and control. And we as feminists, radical Black feminists is what I am, but any kind of feminist has to be diametrically opposed to any system and any institution that says that women and girls do not have right, autonomy, and choice over their bodies. And so that is the consequence of policing on women, girls, and queer and trans folks. And defund means liberation of that. Defund means freedom for that. And so we have to, as feminists, be fighting to defund the police. Is part of how we are going to win complete control, power, autonomy, and rights over ourselves, our bodies, and our lives.
Thank you so much. I know we're going to transition and continue the conversation, and there's just so much richness there. We'll have more time to engage audience around that. And just want to call the names of Sandra Bland, Tatiana Jefferson, Corinne Gaines, Breonna Taylor, right? Our sisters who we know were and are accessing bodily autonomy and safety and sovereignty, and what that means, right, for how we bring our children up and into their own liberatory space and existence. And you've given us a lot to think about and where we battle
Exactly.
our contradiction. So thank you.
Yes, she has given us so much, and I just want to say thank you for bringing up Sandra Bland, because she was actually my sorority sister of Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority Incorporated. And we're always honoring her life and what she, stands for. And we do this thing called Sandy is Still Speaking. And so that was really important that we do that, so that so that we can continue to talk about those things that you talked about, and Adams, as far as letting our young girls know, this is your body and no one has a right to invade your body, especially without your permission. And just speaking along the lines of when, young girls at school, I have 4 daughters, I have 8 boys and 4 girls between my husband and I. And yes, I said that right, 8 boys, 4 girls. And one of the things that I teach my children, especially the last 2 that's in the house, is to, stand on your truth. That's what Sandra Bland was doing. She was standing on her truth, and that you will not do this. And it's an injustice to me and my body for you to act this way. And so just real quickly with one of my daughters, they were talking about history and the formation of America. And she told the teacher, Christopher Columbus did not discover America. And my teacher said, what? That's not true. And her teacher said that. And so my daughter was like, no, Christopher Columbus did not discover America. And she was, sent to the principal's office as a result of that, and saying that she was being insubordinate. And I was like, but she was telling the truth. So you call me, to fuss at my daughter for standing in her truth and knowing, her history. Because Christopher Columbus did not, and this is in 2019, and we're still teaching that. And so we also have to look at, as Attorney Morales said, accountability, even in our education system, and then teaching our young people that you are not victims, and to not behave such as with what society puts you in. But on another topic of what you was talking about with defunding the police, a lot of I guess political people, elected officials, were saying in this recent election that don't say that anymore. Don't talk about defunding the police. But I use it sometimes, and sometimes I don't. But I use it as a way of which is my next question to you is, what do you think about victim services? Because especially when it comes to the transgender community, people think that victim services are not, it's not up to par. It's not effective. And I think that if we put more services, especially when it comes to mental health and the transgender community or the LGBTQ community, that there should be funding within that framework of victim services, for that. So can you talk just a couple of minutes, and then we can move on to the next question.
So what do I think about victim services?
Yeah, especially when it comes to the transgender community and where it's lacking. It's really lacking. And some people think it's just not, lacking. Someone said lacking resources. It really is. And how does that work with when you talk about defunding the police?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that my organization does is we do direct services, but with a particular type of lens, right? We're maybe different than other organizations that are more transactional, where it's like you come and get your thing and then you leave. We actually are trying to be transformative. So we think about what people need and not just giving them what they need, but inviting them into the organization, seeing them as leaders in the movement to end sexual violence. So we do a lot of work along with providing the services. And we do provide services that are culturally specific to Black and Southeast Asian, queer, trans, and intersex people. So the short answer is there's not at all enough services, not enough support given to transgender, intersex, gender nonconforming communities at all. I mean, we should be in the streets, unsettled, flipping out, because we should see and understand that we are in a crisis because of the high death and homicide rate of Black transgender women. We should not be okay with that. We should see that as a pandemic, as one of the many pandemics that is killing our community as we speak. And so we need to be investing into Black trans leadership. We need to be investing into Black transgender survivors, right? We cannot be okay with it. And a report was done this by the National Black Justice Coalition, that the average household income for Black transgender households, not just one person, the entire household is $10,000 a year or less, the average. We cannot be okay with living in a community or a society that continues to make Black transgender people, in particular Black transgender women, vulnerable to violence. We know that when folks' needs are not met, that they become vulnerable to violence, either because they cannot house themselves, meet their needs, and are forced to be putting themselves at risk, or forced to dealing with abuse that they cannot escape. We should not be okay with that. We should be flipping out about that. This is why the state needs to defund that police and put that money in services, right? Absolutely. And then there's also a lot that we can do as a people, as a community, right? Outside of the state and outside of the state, turning over its resources, right? We can no longer be in a society, be inside of a culture where we think that transphobia is okay, right? We can no longer be fine or okay with people being able to harm women and girls, all women and girls, transgender women and cisgender women and girls, and be okay with that. So that's why campaigns like that target abuse and violence that is happening to women and girls, transgender or not women and girls, is really, really important. So yes, more resources to services. And what we know is that prevention is the best intervention. And so we really need to be investing in creating change in communities to prevent violence altogether.
Thank you so much. I totally agree with that. You're absolutely right. And, we should reach out to, organizations that are, such as yourself, that are providing resources. So thank you so much. My next question is to Mr. Adams. No, not Adams. That's you.
That's
Dr. Lester. Okay, I'm gonna get it together, y'all. I told you I'm operating on lack of sleep, so I'm gonna get it together. Let's see. Okay. Dr. Neil Lester, how you doing? Welcome to National Organization for Women.
Thank you.
And being on this awesome panel. And we want to just zoom in a little bit. We know that the discrimination that Black and Brown communities have been experiencing did not begin under the Trump administration. I remember Denzel Washington said that, it's not that things are being revealed now, is that they're being recorded. And so can you talk a bit about the political moment in its broader cultural context, specifically how perceived racial hierarchy and the ideology of white supremacy have influenced and shaped our policy, particularly our criminal justice system policies that impact the Black and Brown community, and especially women and girls. Okay, I know I packed a lot in there.
Right. And what I really like to do is sit back and respond to my two previous panelists, because they said a mouthful, and we could
so much there. And Dr. Lester, I know we're moving into like the part where we get to converse a little bit, and we're coming to a close.
Yeah.
And as you think about bringing your your points together, I think that we have not yet attended to the conversation around what we do with the harm doer. We've talked a lot about what we do with the harmed. We've talked a lot about restorative justice processes for them. We haven't talked about the problem, the crisis of masculinity in BIPOC communities, right? We haven't discussed that yet. And though we could all speak on it, I just want to make sure you also think about that and situate that in your response to this question as we talk about cultural context.
So this is the hardest place to be, because now I have to like, okay, pull all this together. Okay, so let me just say, first of all, thank you, because you could have done this panel without me. I am not adding anything profound to this. Let me just add this though. You know, I'm always looking to voices of those who are marginalized in order to give me strength and guidance and direction. And when we're talking about the beginning of where all this starts, because I hear that too. You know, in the work that I do, people are saying, oh my gosh, we're a nation of immigrants, or we're just so violent. We've never been violent before. And I was like, well, wait a minute. The very founding of this country was based in violence. And let me just share with you what resonates with me and gives me a reason to pass on, so that people can stop that thinking and actually move toward the truth, which is what we're trying to get at today. Toni Morrison, you may recall, in 2011 was at a commencement in Rutgers, and she said this: I've often wished that Jefferson had not used that phrase, the pursuit of happiness, as the third right. Although I understand in the first draft, it was life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Of course, I would have been one of those properties one had the right to pursue. So I suppose happiness is an ethical improvement over a life devoted to the acquisition of land, the acquisition of resources, the acquisition of slaves. Still, she adds, I would rather he had written life, liberty, and the pursuit of meaningfulness, or integrity, or truth. And it's the integrity and the truth part that's been missing from these conversations here. Not here, but in the larger community. The truth is that white supremacy is a reality. It is a pollutant that has suffocated and killed and disabled and traumatized everyone. And all of us have been both benefactors of that white supremacy, and we've been complicit in it. And as we were talking today, I kept thinking of, you know, the ways in which performative justice can be, or restorative justice can be performative. And people are very good at performing. And then I was thinking about M, and M referenced this notion of, you know, the adultification of Black children. And I couldn't help but bring up Stacey Patton's book about Spare the Kids, Why Whipping Children Won't Save Black America. How many times have we looked historically and with humor at beating Black children? Think about that. That is a manifestation of white supremacy, because that's what masters did to those enslaved people. So for those who keep saying, well, how do we move forward? Because that's often what I get when people call me in from their Rolodex. They're like, well, how do we get from here? And I'm like, well, we can't move forward until we look back at how we got here. And one of the ways of looking back is look back at the very founding of this country, where violence was predicated upon the exploitation of Black and brown bodies. So that's why, for me, in order for us to get at truth and meaningfulness, we have to look at the very roots of policing that started in the Black codes and the rise of the KKK and lynching and Jim Crow, and the reality that 80% of police are still white and male. And if we shift over to Audre Lorde, who told us about that mythical norm that's white and male and heterosexual and cisgender and financially stable, that leaves everybody else over in here in this minoritized group. And the people who are still wielding the power are still mostly white and male. So my response to so much of what's going on is that we have to, in order to understand what is going on in the present, we have to go back to the past and realize that those things are intricately connected, and masculinities have been fundamentally central to that. We hear case after case where Black folks are killed because they didn't listen, they didn't behave. We hear that also when we talk about domestic violence. The women or the children didn't listen, they didn't behave. That's a very paternalistic and patriarchal notion of how we interact with folks that is very gendered and very racialized. And I'll say this also, we've got to dispel this myth that bad policing is about a few bad apples. That is just not true. It is fundamentally about systems. So it's not about who your chief is, but it is about who your chief is. And we have to look at, for example, that January 6th insurrection and call it what it is, and not dance around and say that is not a demonstration of white privilege and white supremacy 101. It is there for all the world to see. And then the last point, or the last 2 points I'll make, one is about, we have to recognize that when M and others are talking about defunding the police, that is fundamentally underscoring the reality that capitalism and racism are, as Kendi says, conjoined twins. So when we start talking about defunding the police, we start getting at some of the roots of what that systemic white supremacy manifests as in that institution. But the other institution is education, though. It's about these student resource officers that we have planted in Black and brown schools that are over policing Latinx and brown communities. Some of these richer communities don't have police at the door and going through these metal detectors, but where are these mass shootings in high schools? So that's what I'm asking. We have to stop, treating our children as though they're adults and looking at that school to prison pipeline as a reality. And it's not based on individuals' behavior, but on a system that individuals are trying to navigate. So for me, we have to acknowledge that history is always part of the present. And if we're gonna deal with truth, if people want to move the needle, I'm not convinced that people want to move the needle. Part of defunding the police, part of anti-racism work is that people have to give up stuff, and people don't want to give up stuff. And that to me is the heart of how we move that needle and address all this. That's why we would have Latinx men and Black men voting for people they voted for in this last election, because people benefit from it at the expense of other people, their fundamental livelihood. And nobody is always interested in disrupting the status quo, as everybody on this panel and people who are attending this event are committed to doing. So I don't know if that answered any of your questions. But
yes, that did. But mainly, one of the things that you said, that it's power. People don't want to give up their power. But right. We're having to deal with, from January 6th, and even in this impeachment trial, and even in our electors, it's power. They don't want to give up the power and the control. And then if they let go a little bit, especially people that are not a part of our Black and brown communities, they feel like, oh my gosh, they're gonna treat me how my ancestors treated them. And they have this thing in their head, like, I'm gonna enslave you, I'm gonna crucify you. But reality is, I don't want to crucify you. I don't want to enslave you. All I want to do is live and take care of my family and have justice and equality, what the Constitution have said. And as ML King said, America wrote a check they did not cash, and they have not cashed it to this day in 2021. So I'm sorry, you kind of riled me up there a little bit.
Well, let me just say one thing to address your question, is in terms of the masculinities, we could situate that in many places. One place that we could situate that is that policing, after emancipation, was not about criminals. It was about freed Black folks, primarily freed Black men who were then the rapists who were going after these white, pure women. So thus,
and Black women. And Black women.
And think of the ways in which, Birth of a Nation launched the KKK. So there are ways in which Black masculinity has been at the heart of this threat. That's why we would have the lynching, and the lynching was part of a castration. And this very interesting and twisted homoerotic, castrating and fondling the genitals and sticking in the mouth, because there's a real threat there. And so that's why, when we have conversations about Mike Brown and that police who killed him, talking about him being animal-like, and as he was shooting through the bullets, he kept grunting and coming through them. So if you can justify the animalization of Black bodies, you can kill them. You can kill them.
And also, I think, the added layer to this, which is so important for us to say, is yes, there is this legacy of enslavement and a legacy of policing Black male bodies as a way of preventing and protecting white feminine bodies. But there's also the absence of protecting Black women's bodies, right? Well, and so the absence of police does not equal the absence of patriarchy, right? Yes. I remember at the height of the riots in the summer and the protests just in 2020, when Barclays Center was swarmed with our community and movement, I heard at my window in Crown Heights, in Bed-Stuy, in neighboring Bed-Stuy, someone say, all of the police are occupied at Barclays and we are going to raid communities, right? So even inside of our communities, the absence of police is not the absence of sexual violence. The absence of police is not and I'm not here to say that anyone here said that tonight, right? But when we're articulating community safety, we need to articulate that inside of the frame of our own communities as well, right? Not just in relationship to the state.
Right. And I'm still challenging people to go read Dr. Stacey Patton and think about that when we're making jokes and sending memes around about whipping Black kids somehow because we're saving them. That has not saved anybody from being incarcerated, and it makes it about victimization and victim blaming when you think you can whip your child into safety. And we are so, as a Black community, we laugh about it, we joke about it, we have these testimonies about we are the people we are because we were spanked. That is not why we are the people we are. There is no evidence that shows that spanking and whipping and the fact that this is an adult hitting a child. So we have to think about the ways in which we have been complicit in perpetuating white supremacy and white supremacist practice.
And patriarchal violence, as M named. I know we're coming really close to our close. Thank you, Dr. Lester.
No, we can talk forever. But I thought we have until 7. I thought we because we still have
a couple minutes, yes.
Okay. It's just 6.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay.
But just real quickly, Dr. Lester, on that last point, I'm sorry. I raised 12. And I don't believe that I beat my kids because I was, saving them or anything like that. But I did, I did whoop my kids, and I will continue to whoop their little butts. But not because I want to save them, but I'm also Army. I spent 26 years in the United States Army, so I'm a big disciplinary, and so it's to me it's more about disciplining them and not saving them, because I only believe that the Lord can save you. So I it's not a savior thing to me, but I do believe in spanking children. I believe in that, and I did that. Like I said, I have 8 boys and 4 girls, and I will take a belt in a heartbeat. And they're some in the military, some are college, and some are business owners, and they're doing really good. But it's not because of me beating them, it's because of what I instilled in them and creating their own independent attitudes. But I believe in whooping kids. So
well, and I'm not here to challenge your beliefs. I'm just here to invite us to think about a different way of existing so that we're not perpetuating white supremacists. Because
right.
That's what police do. That's why police do.
I think this is a really good place for M and Attorney Morales for you all to come back in the conversation. And I think one of the questions I'm thinking about, and Triana, you're having me think about this too, is like, what is the liberatory future that we're imagining, right? For our children, for ourselves. And I heard each of you begin articulating this. And again, Dr. Lester, you gave this to us, but I think we can expand it, not just outside of the frame of white supremacy, but outside of the frame of what M articulated as patriarchal violence, right? As dominator culture that Bell Hooks gives us, right? She also says our bodies are the territories we seek to liberate. And that means our children as well, right?
Right.
And so where do we get, and how do we get to even begin to imagine this type of autonomy where there is accountability around harm, where there's actually prevention around harm, where there's recognition from within our communities that harm is not okay, it's not available, it can't creep in, it can't seep in, there's no conditions for it, right? I'm interested in that conversation, taking us beyond these 100 days and thinking about what the next 100 years holds for our communities. What are we truly dreaming of intergenerationally? So we're not having these conversations that are binaristic, and that have us in reaction and in response to white supremacy solely, right? But that we're looking more deeply. So Attorney Morales, you were about to speak. Then I want to bring M back in, and Dr. Lester, if you have some thoughts as well. And I think we have some questions in the chat that we should get to as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was not spanked, to the conversation of corporal punishment. And I don't even think that my mother thought about it as deeply as what the doctor described, but for me, I think that was critical in, you know, my ability to parent differently with my 4 children, and think about what I wanted to do with them to raise them to be the type of young people I want them to be in our society. And what I want for them, and for all of our children and for our society, is the ability for us to thrive, for us to be invested in like other communities were in this country in a way that we never were. I think what we need is to have intergenerational wealth. You talked about the legacy that has gone on, you know, the intergenerational legacy of harm to our children in school, to, you know, violence to our trans community and non-binary community. All of these legacies, you know, we need to flip this and turn it on its head. And we won't do that by this conversation around how we move a needle or incremental change. We must have transformative change. Our criminal legal system that we have, it must be disrupted. It must be torn down and reimagined into something entirely different, because again, it is working as it was designed to work. And so my desire is, I hope I can work myself out of a job. I hope that I would never be a performer. I thought that was beautiful to talk about how restorative justice can be performative. I hope to never be that way. I always will hold myself accountable to truly work to work my way out of a job, you know, to where we don't need the criminal legal system, where it's not the bedrock and the foundation of keeping our community safe, and that we realize that the resources that we are using for incarceration could be used instead to fund the investment in our young people and their education and their food and housing, and not, you know, just passing down this legacy of harming. So, you know, I hope that, you know, I have made myself very clear that as a prosecutor, I acknowledge the harm that my profession has done. And anybody who is not willing to acknowledge that harm and not willing to be a part of reaching back and undoing as much harm as possible and stopping that harm from going forward, they truly, I think, are unfit to serve in these types of positions, because now we see what is truly happening. Social media and the ability to film has put things on display that have not just started, but have been going on for as long as this country has been in existence. So I thank you all for the work that you all are doing, you know, in your everyday life in the trenches, but also to bring awareness about just how much effort we have to put into not just the next 100 days, but indefinitely, to truly see a change and to allow us to thrive in different ways that we have never experienced before. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Thank you. Dr. Lester, any thoughts here before we move to a couple of questions that have come in?
Well, I think the self-reflective piece is good, because I certainly benefit from acknowledging with humility the fact that I can evolve and that my ideas can evolve, and also this willingness to challenge what has already been. I mean, I think it's, you know, if I have to draw on a very bizarre reference here, you know, there was a person in the 90s who said, all you have to use is your imagination. And I think that's one of the problems that we as a people, we as a community have, is we can't imagine what we haven't already experienced. And so the same thing comes with defunding the police. We don't know what that's like if we've never had that before. But what it looks like are those white middle-class communities that don't have police driving through all the time in those schools. So I think that imagination piece and the self-reflective piece are critical to getting at how do we figure out what the strategies are without looking for a single one, but rather multiple strategies that are multi-pronged.
I appreciate that, especially in these times as we're thinking about what it means to rebuild the administration, what it means to reconstruct our communities, right?
Yeah.
That there's not one single strategy or approach,
Right.
but it requires all of our strategies and to be multifaceted.
Right.
As we close just this segment and take maybe 1 or 2 comments from the chat.
Yeah, so I see that the chat is very full, still speaking on the subject of how we treat our children. So I'll just quickly say something about that, maybe.
Yes, please.
You know, I know that, you know, one of the things that's really important about feminisms, and why I think feminisms is key to anchoring gender justice work, is feminisms, I think, asserts that we are our first area of exploration. We are our first practice at liberation. And what I know And thinking about that is how I treat my children is how they expect the world to be. And so I think we have a requirement to treat our children. And for me, in general, as a feminist, I really try to live my life with a value set that says I must demonstrate what I want the world to be. And I know for my children, I'm often their first sight of love, right? I'm their biggest love, their deepest love, and a love that's going to last them a lifetime. And so it is for me to really model what should be in hopes that if something comes that is starkly different, they'll be able to recognize it and confront it and walk away and move away from it. And so I really do think it's upon us to be able to model inside of our communities with our children, with our partners, with our neighbors, with the people down the street. Because I cannot politically ask for grace of Black children. I cannot be outraged when I see a Black child mistreated on YouTube, but willing to do the same to the one that I raised, that is mine, that I love. And so I think that we have to model, or that's what my feminisms teach me. It says that I cannot only think these things big picture politically, but I have to model them every day in my dailiness. And I think that extends, or our children is part of that. But abolition.
No, thank you. And I think when you say that, I think about all of the things we need to abolish in our communities, right? I am very interested in what parts of the state and what parts of the system we need to abolish. But what can we abolish at home, right? In terms of patriarchy, in terms of sexism, in terms of violence and harm against one another in the community, sexual violence, violence against our children. And that's not just pointing to the conversation that we've had today.
No,
but that's also thinking about what their dreams are, the way that they perceive their bodies, the way that they perceive themselves in the context of community, the way they perceive themselves in the context of family, right? And thus the way the state will ultimately engage with them, whether or not they opt in or out of that. So again, you've given us, right, the way to think about this and situate this inside of a feminist framework, and really like not just how when we're talking about this, we're not just talking about how we're surviving these current conditions.
Right.
We're talking about how we perceive ourselves thriving beyond our current imaginary, right, of what we deserve, of what our children deserve, of what future generations deserve. And so I think this conversation, this listening series is going to have us call that into question every single time. And I appreciate you, Attorney Morales, Dr. Lester, for being in rigorous dialogue. I think there's a lot we still have to cover. There's a lot we still have to cover. I think
that's good.
Yeah,
that's good.
And I think, I'm going to turn it to Cecile, Triana, if that's okay with you, just to hear. Maybe there's one or two questions that have come through the chat. And I know also that people are grappling with this conversation. And I want to recognize and identify, the 125 of us that have been on tonight and those who are watching and listening on Facebook and other platforms are grappling in a real way, in a spiritual way, in an emotional way, in a political way. And while there's program and there's run of show and there's all of that behind the scenes, there's also our very lives and our very situations, our lived experiences. And so as we move through the closing of tonight, just know it is not the end, right? And there are so many other ways we can be rigorous and be in conversation with each other. So Cecile, if there are questions, we can be creative about how we get to everyone's questions. I know we can't do that in the live session tonight, but if there are one or two or some that should be brought to the attention of the panelists, please let us know.
Yeah, well, first, thank you all so much for such an incredibly rich and deep dialogue, and for sharing so many personal and important pieces of this conversation. And as Dr. Lester said, you can't create change that we don't have the imagination for. So we all have to really imagine outside of our usual pathways to find what's next. And so there were a lot of questions, and I just want to thank everyone for submitting their questions. But I think you covered so much ground that the two questions that I'd like to touch on, and perhaps start off with Attorney Morales, They both have to do with how we as the audience can really move forward. What are the ways, one of them from Elizabeth is, what are the ways we can demand defunding of police? How do we persuade others that defunding does not mean no protection, but that it means specific measures, and what would these measures entail? So how can we move forward with that? And I'm going to ask the second question so that other people can jump in as well. The second question was also about how can the mission of police departments be transformed from an authoritarian force using predominantly power and force to get compliance into a compassionate force with empathy and a sense of community and responsibility and mutual respect. So I think two questions, on both sides of the coin there. How do we respond and how can we get the police to be different?
Yeah, so I love that question. I feel that, people in my profession, people who are advocates, there was a little bit of this came up earlier, but there is this discomfort around talking about defunding the police. And that has to stop. Black people in our neighborhoods, children in their schools, they don't get treated like divas, where, when they talk about cutting funding for education, people get real uncomfortable and want to call it something different or come up with a special way to say it so that we don't rub somebody the wrong way. When we're talking about defunding the police, we have to acknowledge we don't have unlimited resources as a society. We don't have unlimited resources as communities and government. And so if we are spending so many resources on policing and on incarceration, and that's what we're invested in, then we are in turn not investing in the education of our young people. We are not investing in food, housing, all the things that I keep talking about, in order to really create this opportunity, medical care, psychological help, all of the things that we can do to rebuild ourselves and rebuild our children and invest in our communities. We cannot do these things. We cannot have, a mental health response unit going out if we are spending all of our resources on policing and incarceration. We have to stop being so concerned about people's feelings. I'm not here to be your friend, police. I'm here to operate out of mutual respect and serve our community. And so if anybody is truly here to serve, they want to see, people thrive. They want our needs to be met, our children's needs to be met, and people not to encounter harm and endure suffering, then the conversation should be easy to have about how we take these resources and put them where they need to be in order for us to save our people and to move our society where we want it to go. That's it. That's the bottom line. And as soon as we can get comfortable addressing what has been uncomfortable, like now we're getting to have conversations about systemic racism, conversations that we didn't used to be able to have until our society was confronted with the truth that came out on television and on social media. We've got to have these conversations and stop trying to make it cute and stop trying to worry about people's feelings. Because anybody who is trying to, get with me about how we better something, they don't have to worry about my feelings because it's not about me. And as soon as you start thinking that something won't touch you, that's as soon as you will find out that it is going to touch you. Because until all of us are straight, none of us are. And I really think it's that simple.
Mm-hmm. I'll add that part of the strategy, and I'm always not hesitant, but I'm always curious. I direct this initiative called Project Humanities. And right after Trayvon Martin's death, I was called in by one of the local police stations to talk to them about some community work that I'd been doing on privilege and bias. And one of the things that I try to talk to folks about who are in those positions is that they weren't born police. And they don't necessarily die as police. They're policing when they're in that uniform. So there are ways in which not only individuals can respond to this notion of humanity, but organizations can look at this through the lens of humanity. And it's not any different from MLK when he said that in order to address anti-Blackness and capitalism and militarism and all of those things that were denying humanity of Black folks, is how do you connect humanity with justice and equality? And it's through these things like compassion and empathy, forgiveness, integrity, kindness, respect, and self-reflection. These are not extras. These are not desserts. These are fundamental because they're about relationships. So this is about relationships with ourselves, relationships with our communities, relationships with other folks. So, I've seen people sort of realize that when you say Black Lives Matter and they respond Blue Lives Matter, that doesn't make any sense. And I also have seen people sort of look at this when you say all lives matter, and you say, well, historically, that's not the case. Poor people's lives don't matter. That's what King was fighting. So there are ways in which we can use various strategies than looking for a single pill that's going to fix the high blood pressure that is racism in this country, that is white supremacy and anti-Blackness. So I'm challenging folks in the work that I do, both as groups in my classes, is to look at what am I denying or extending someone humanity, and what is what I'm doing saying about my own humanity or lack thereof. That's not a complicated question to ask. The complicated part is answering that, and you can do that systemically and also based on our individual interactions with folks.
So thank you, Dr. Lester. Em, do you want to just close out this Q&A with possibly some active steps that community can take to join in with what you're doing, or on their own in their communities, in order to move the defund police movement forward?
Sure. So if folks feel like they've never been invited into movement, consider this your invitation, right? We are always looking for people who are serious about the work of freedom and liberation. We need everyone who is interested in freedom and liberation to join the movement. And there are all types of things that you can do inside of that movement. But the main thing is you got to believe. You got to believe, and you have to have vision and hope that it is possible, right? We have enough naysayers, and what we need is people wherever they are, whatever they are positioned to do, to believe that another world is possible and do everything that they can in their own respective power to achieve that. So if you are working at a supermarket and you are a believer there, do everything that you can in that space, in your perspective, in the world to achieve that. If you are doing homework, care work, if you are a mechanic, a doctor, or organizer, wherever you are, right? And so the movement is full of people with complex lives, and we need everybody wherever they are to be thinking about how to advance abolition in their own respective lives. And that deals with how you treat your partner, how you treat the loved ones in your home, how you treat community members, how you treat the kid down the street who broke a window at your car or something like that, right? It has to do with you and your daily life being willing to practice a world in which you interact with one another without using punishment.
Thank
Can
you.
we imagine being
Yes.
different with one another? So text 90975,
Yes.
the word defend to join the movement, and we'll.
Thank you, Em. Thank you, Attorney Morales. Thank you, Dr. Lester. Triana, I think this conversation was rich. It was bold. It was exactly what was needed. I know that there's more that we need to discuss, but tonight we'll close here, right? And gratitude to this group for just the vastness and richness of this conversation. I hope that you'll join us back on February 25th as we talk about reproductive justice, holistic approaches, the demands that we want to make. We're going to be building on this conversation. We're going to be centering our children. We're going to be centering women and girls again. And just so much gratitude to National Organization for Women for partnering with Black Women's Blueprint and for bringing these brilliant minds and movement leaders together. We will pass along the questions to our panelists so that we can be in deeper conversation together. I also wanted to thank Santana Chavez for bringing us through and bringing ASL interpretation to this conversation and ensuring that there's accessibility and providing fierce accessibility to this conversation that will be available each time. So please do follow the organizers, follow the conversation, sign up for the rest of the series, and we'll be with you for the rest of the 100 days. Triana, any last words as we close?
Yes, thank you so much, Savona. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm so bad with names. And to the panelists, Dr. Lester, Attorney Morales, and M. Adams. Thank you all so much for all of the spirited discussion. And this is only the beginning. This is not just a one-stop shop. This is the beginning because, you know, just because we have a Democrat in the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives doesn't mean that we have to sit back and relax. One of the things that I don't want us to do is sit back and fold our arms and say, hey, we have arrived, because we haven't. We haven't. There's more work to be done. And even with this discussion and talking about police brutality and then bringing in the police, we also have to talk about mental health, you know, and how they deal with mental health, how they deal with veterans, and things like that. And so this is, like I said, this is not the end. This is the beginning, and we should continue these conversations and also turn them into call to actions, such as joining M. Adams' organization and being a part of that and supporting, you know, Attorney Morales and Dr. Lester and everything that they're doing, but make it a call to action, because we have not arrived. We have more work to do. If anything, these last 4.5 years have shown us that we have a lot of work to do, especially when it comes to race relations, and dealing with our police, because, and you all know, if that was Black Lives Matter on January 6th, it would have been a lot of people dead. Honestly, it would have been a lot of people dead. It wouldn't have been a hesitant of not shooting. And so we have to look at that reality. If the tables would turn, and it was Black Lives Matter, how things would be so different. But that just proves one more point that we have a lot of work to do. So thank you, especially to my organization, National Organization for Women. I love each and every one of you all. I'm looking forward to talking with you all more. And on all social media platforms, I'm Triana for Georgia, Triana, the number 4 Georgia, on all social media platforms. And so if we want to stay in touch, let's stay in touch and keep this going. So thank you and God bless.